What's up everyone, it's Ben at ProFixer, and I'm going to show you how to change the port on a 3DS. This particular repair applies for a lot of the Nintendo handhelds that use the same charge port. But first thing that you want to do is apply FLUX. You want to put a little bit of a substantial amount, but not so much that it's just overtaking the board. But here I'm just putting like a little tiny dot on each one. So you want more than a smear, less than a glob, so just kind of a little dot on each solder point. Then you want to take your soldering iron and make sure that the tip has been cleaned and tinned. The particular tip I'm using here is probably not the best. My other tip actually broke, and so I'm waiting for a new one to come in, but decided to make a video anyways as we needed this repair done for a customer. So it makes it a little bit harder to use one of these more pointy conical tips, but it works pretty good by itself as well. But go ahead and get a little bit of low melt on the solder tip, and then go ahead and touch each of the solder points. What you want to do is make sure that it gets hot enough that it moltens all of the solder that's existing, as well as the low melt, and once they mix, it will give you a lot lower temperature for your working temperature for the solder. So your port will come right off. On this particular one, it was giving me a little bit of trouble. I thought there was some port or a pad underneath or whatnot, but that was actually a little bit of solder or a little bit of adhesive right there. But once I realized that it was just adhesive, went ahead and pulled the port off. Didn't want to pull any pads or anything. What you'll get next is your desolder braid, and you want to remove all of the low melt. You don't want any low melt left because it can weaken your solder joints. So you want to make sure that you take all of the low melt off. And so what I've done here, I've gotten my braid, added a little bit of flux to it, and now I'm just passing it over the pads, removing all of the low melt that's there. And if you notice, my braid goes off screen and comes back and it's clean again. I'm actually snipping the end of it off as it fills up with low melt. And these two right side pads here were actually kind of buggered up from the previous charge port. It had actually like fallen or something like that, and so it kind of tore these a little bit. But that's no big deal because more than 90% of the pad is still left. But it kind of makes it a little bit harder to remove the solder from because your braid will grip a little bit whenever you are passing it over those. But you want to remove all the solder. Next, follow it up with some 99% iso alcohol, some isopropyl alcohol. Just using a Q-tip and removing all of the flux that's left on there. You don't want too much alcohol because that can drip into the screen and cause issues that way. But just a little bit, enough to make it wet so you can remove the flux that's there, and so it can break it down. So now that we've cleaned up all the old flux that's all burnt up and used, we'll want to put on new flux. And so here I'm just putting a little bit, not as much as I did before, because I don't want as much flux whenever I am resoldering that port. Because we are using rosin core solder, and here I am going ahead and tinning one of the pads. And I'm only tinning one of these, and I'll show you my technique behind this. So all the rest have no solder at all on them. I'm going to go ahead and lay my port on top, apply a little bit of pressure, but make sure that you're completely lined up. Apply pressure with your finger, and then put your soldering iron in there and melt that pad with that solder that you applied. What will happen is you'll feel the charge port drop down into place, and now your charge port is held into place. I did not do this with one of the power pins in the middle, as those are very, very important. I did it with one of the outer pins because if those get ripped or whatnot, that's totally fine. Here I am doing the opposite side, doing the same exact thing. So I put a little bit of solder in there, and then I'm pushing on the port and introducing the soldering iron again to get that port into place. And now whenever you look at it, it is perfect in place, completely held in with the solder, so it's very, very strong. I tinned the tip there and went ahead and touched the pad and the small leg of the component and introduced a little more solder. And so here I'm coming up from the top, going to heat up the pad there, drop a little bit of solder in, and then lastly, once I've made sure everything is done correctly, I'm going to do the power pins here. And so just heating up from the side, so I touch the leg of the actual lead of the charge port as well as the pad, and then putting a little bit of solder in there. And these are pretty big, so you can really solder it almost like a soldering big capacitors or whatnot on a PCB board, where you have your solder and then or where you have your soldering iron, and then you introduce some solder actually from the reel of the soldering the solder wire. So here, just inspecting it, making sure that it looks good from all angles and that it's completely sitting flat and that it's straight. This is very important because you don't want to have any issues with it not fitting back inside of the housing, and just want to make sure it sits completely flat. Getting the Q-tip again with a little bit of ISO on it, we'll want to make sure that we are cleaning this up. Once again, don't use too much alcohol because you don't want it to go everywhere and get underneath the screen, but just enough to break down the burned up flux that's on there. And the flux shouldn't be too hard, so it should be very easy to get off. And but here I'm going to clean it real quick and make sure everything's cleaned. That one that's very far over there next to that anchor point for a screw is kind of hard to get in. So after cleaning them and inspecting it, I look at it and I see a little bit of burned up flux still around that edge over there. So I'm getting my tweezers and just going to scrape just a little bit to break some of that burned up flux off of there, and cleans it up and then makes it nice, because then whenever you come back with the Q-tip again, it comes off really nicely, and each and every one of the legs on this port look really, really good. But this is how you change out the charge port on a 3DS. Hope you find it useful. If you have any questions, let me know. Comment below or send me a message and we'll get it all figured out. You'll have a great one. Thanks.